The first thing I noticed was the sound. Children screaming, plastic slides rattling, metal swings squeaking in the middle of what was supposed to be my private property. I stood there at 6 in the morning staring through the fog, while half a dozen strangers unloaded playground equipment onto my vacant lot like they owned it. Bright yellow caution tape had already been ripped down. Fresh concrete had been poured overnight. And right in the center of the property sat a giant HOA sign that read, "Coming soon, Willow Creek Community Play Area." My land, my tax bill, my liability. When I confronted the HOA president, she smiled like I was interrupting a neighborhood picnic. "You abandoned the lot," she said. "The community needed it more than you did." What they didn't know was that I'd spent the last 8 years working in commercial land compliance and municipal permitting. I knew exactly how dangerous what they'd done really was. One warning. That's all I gave them. 3 days later, county inspectors, a sheriff's deputy, and a process server showed up at their board meeting with a stack of papers thick enough to stop every conversation in the room cold. And that was only the beginning. The property sat on the edge of a rapidly expanding subdivision just outside a growing commuter town. Most people saw it as an empty dirt lot wedged between expensive homes and a retention pond. To me, it was the most important investment I'd ever made. I bought the land 12 years earlier after selling my small excavation business during a brutal market downturn. While everyone else chased flashy developments, I focused on overlooked parcels near future infrastructure projects. That lot was supposed to become part of my retirement plan once the nearby highway expansion finished. I maintained the property carefully. Taxes paid early every year. Boundary markers refreshed every spring. Insurance active. Survey records updated. But because I didn't build on it immediately, the HOA treated the land like an inconvenience. Willow Creek Estates was one of those neighborhoods obsessed with appearances. Perfect lawns, matching fences, rules about mailbox paint colors. The HOA board acted less like volunteers and more like a private government. At the center of it all was Denise Holloway. Denise had the polished smile of someone who enjoyed controlling people. Former real estate agent, constantly overdressed for casual events. She spoke in that syrupy tone people use when they think they're smarter than everyone else. From the beginning, she hated my lot. She called it an eyesore, claimed it lowered property values, told neighbors it attracted undesirable activity, even though the property was fenced, maintained, and cleaner than half the backyards in the subdivision. For years, I ignored her. Then the complaints started escalating. Violation notices for grass supposedly being half an inch too tall, threats about debris that didn't exist, anonymous reports to the county about illegal dumping. Somebody even cut one of my survey stakes out of the ground. I knew Denise was behind it, but I stayed calm because I understood something she didn't. Paper trails matter more than emotions. And eventually she made a mistake big enough that no amount of HOA money or neighborhood gossip could protect her from it. The moment I saw that playground sitting on my land, I knew she'd finally crossed from annoying into catastrophic. Because playgrounds create liability, insurance exposure, permit requirements, DA compliance obligations, safety inspections. And if even one child got hurt on unapproved equipment installed illegally on private property, the lawsuit alone could bankrupt people. Denise thought she'd embarrassed me publicly. What she actually did was hand me the strongest legal leverage of my entire life. Most people in Willow Creek saw the lot as empty space. That was their first mistake. The property sat on just under 3 acres near the edge of the subdivision, boxed between the retention pond and a stretch of undeveloped frontage the county had already marked for future highway expansion. To the average homeowner, it looked like dusty ground covered in scrubgrass and gravel. But to anyone who understood land development, it was obvious what was coming. Traffic was growing every year. New retail projects were creeping closer from the south side of town. A proposed highway exit sat less than 2 miles away. Once that interchange got approved, commercial prices in the area would explode. That lot wasn't random land to me. It was my retirement. I'd bought it after selling my excavation business during a rough financial stretch years earlier. While everybody else chased fast money in housing developments, I focused on long-term infrastructure growth, quiet parcels, overlooked corners, land people ignored until the city suddenly needed it. And over time, developers started noticing. I'd already received 3 informal inquiries from commercial buyers asking if I'd consider selling once the highway project officially moved forward. One of them hinted at a convenience store chain looking for future expansion property. Another mentioned storage development. The HOA knew all of that. That's what made Denise so obsessed with the land. Some of the neighbors acted like I was selfish for leaving it undeveloped, but underneath the complaints was jealousy. They hated staring at a property they couldn't control while knowing it was becoming more valuable every year, especially because I wasn't even part of their HOA. I lived about 10 minutes away on county land outside subdivision limits. That detail irritated Denise more than anything. She couldn't find me, threaten my home, or use HOA rules against me directly. And legally, she had no authority over that parcel whatsoever. The lot had never been transferred into HOA ownership. Not partially. Not conditionally. Not accidentally. The deed records were crystal clear, which meant every single thing they eventually did to that property, they did knowing it was mine. Denise Holloway had perfected the art of looking helpful while making people miserable. If you saw her during neighborhood events, you'd think she was some kind of community hero. She organized holiday decorating contests, smiled through charity fundraisers, and constantly posted inspirational quotes in the HOA Facebook group beside pictures of perfectly trimmed flower beds. But privately, Denise ruled Willow Creek like a woman auditioning to become mayor of a tiny dictatorship. Everything was about control. The HOA bylaws became weapons in her hands. One family got fined because their garbage cans stayed visible an extra hour after pickup. Another resident received violation notices over a basketball hoop that had supposedly been visually disruptive. Denise even encouraged neighbors to report each other anonymously through the HOA website. Public shaming became normal. Every week, somebody's house ended up photographed and posted online with passive-aggressive captions about community standards. Residents smiled around Denise in public, then complained about her quietly behind closed doors because nobody wanted to become her next target. Intimidation was her real talent. She never yelled, never lost composure. Denise preferred that calm, polished tone people use when they think they already own the room. Our first serious confrontation happened beside my lot one windy afternoon while I was replacing damaged survey stakes. She walked across the dirt wearing expensive sunglasses and holding a clipboard like she was inspecting military property. "You really should landscape this," she said, glancing around disapprovingly. "The neighborhood has standards." I kept hammering the survey marker into the ground. "The neighborhood doesn't own this property." She smiled tightly. "Everything around here affects the community." I stood up slowly and brushed dirt off my gloves. "That doesn't make it yours." For the first time, her expression cracked, just for a second. But I saw it. Denise wasn't offended because I disagreed with her. She was offended because somebody had told her no. The harassment started small enough that most people would have brushed it off. That was probably the point. About 2 weeks after my argument with Denise, I got my first county complaint notice claiming the property had become an illegal dumping site. I drove over expecting to find trash scattered everywhere. Nothing. The lot looked exactly the way I'd left it the day before. A month later, another complaint came in. This time, someone reported unsafe debris and construction materials. Again, county inspectors found nothing except gravel piles that had been sitting there legally for years. Then came the parking problems. Residents suddenly started leaving vehicles near the narrow gravel entrance to the property, making it difficult for me to pull equipment trailers through the gate. Every time I cleared the area, another car appeared a few days later like clockwork. That's when I realized this wasn't random neighborhood irritation anymore. It was organized pressure. And slowly, the attitude around Willow Creek changed. Neighbors who used to wave stopped making eye contact. Conversations cut short when I walked by. I overheard people referring to my property as that abandoned lot, even though I maintained it more consistently than most of their lawns. So I installed trail cameras, not flashy security systems, just small motion-activated cameras hidden near fence lines and entrance posts. Experience had taught me something important about property disputes. People lie less when timestamps exist. The first footage shocked even me. 2 HOA maintenance workers crossed onto the property late one evening carrying tools and reflective vests. They weren't cutting grass or cleaning debris. They were removing survey stakes. I drove out the next morning and found 3 boundary markers missing entirely. That wasn't just petty harassment. In many counties, tampering with legal survey markers can carry serious civil penalties because those markers establish official property boundaries used in development, taxation, and legal disputes. But even after seeing the footage, I stayed calm. I'd dealt with land conflicts before, and emotional reactions only helped the aggressor. Denise wanted a loud confrontation she could spin into neighborhood drama. Instead, I started documenting everything quietly, because every fake complaint, every removed marker, every trespass onto that property was building a paper trail she didn't even realize I was collecting. A few months later, Denise started using a new phrase during HOA meetings. Community expansion projects. At first, it sounded harmless. Walking trails, decorative landscaping, maybe another picnic area near the retention pond. But the more she talked about it, the more often her eyes drifted toward my property. Then one evening, while fueling my truck at a gas station near Willow Creek, I overheard two residents talking about the future playground. One of them casually pointed toward my lot. That empty space would honestly be perfect. I didn't interrupt them. I just listened. Within weeks, the rumors spread everywhere. Denise had apparently been telling residents the property had been sitting abandoned for years. Some people even believed the HOA was already negotiating to acquire it for community use. That was the genius of what she was doing. She kept blurring the line between private ownership and public space until people stopped questioning where one ended and the other began. Then I received the email. A short, overly polite message from an LLC I'd never heard of offering to purchase the property for an amount so low it was almost insulting. The number wasn't even close to market value, but the wording caught my attention. The sender mentioned how the land could finally serve the neighborhood properly. I declined professionally and moved on. A week later, I attended a public HOA meeting out of curiosity. The moment Denise saw me walk in, her entire posture changed. Her smile tightened. Her voice sharpened. For the rest of the meeting, she kept making passive-aggressive comments about unused land hurting community growth. That's when my instincts started screaming that something bigger was happening. And a few days later, I found proof. Bright orange utility paint markings had appeared along the edge of my property near the road frontage. Fresh markings. Recent markings. The kind contractors use before excavation work begins. I stood there staring at those lines in the dirt with a knot forming in my stomach. Because nobody marks land like that unless construction is coming soon. I woke up at 5:42 in the morning to the sound of machinery. At first I thought it was highway work from the county road nearby, but then I heard the distinct metallic slam of augers biting into dirt. Heavy equipment. Close. Too close. I threw on boots, grabbed my truck keys and drove straight toward the lot with a bad feeling already building in my chest. The moment I turned the corner, my stomach dropped. Two skid steers were parked inside my property line. Contractors in reflective vests were unloading playground equipment from flatbed trailers while another crew dug post holes near the center of the lot. Wooden concrete forms had already been laid out in rectangular sections, and stacks of bright plastic slides sat wrapped in shipping plastic beside the fence. And hanging directly across my entrance gate was a giant vinyl banner. Willow Creek Community Play Area coming soon. My property. My fence. My land. I slammed the truck door hard enough that several workers turned toward me immediately. A man wearing a white hard hat stepped forward holding a clipboard. You the homeowner? I'm the owner, I said sharply. What exactly do you think you're doing? The foreman looked confused more than defensive. We were hired by the HOA. They said this parcel was subdivision common area. I pulled the folded survey packet from my truck almost on instinct. Years of dealing with land issues had trained me to keep copies nearby. I handed him the parcel map, deed records, and county tax information. The man's face changed instantly. You've got to be kidding me. Within minutes, the atmosphere shifted completely. Workers stopped unloading materials. One operator shut down his equipment mid-drill. Another crew member started making nervous phone calls near the trailer. Then Denise arrived. Black SUV. Oversized sunglasses. Perfectly calm. She stepped out like she was arriving for brunch instead of illegal construction on private property. Oh good, she said casually. You're finally here. I stared at her in disbelief. You told contractors this land belongs to the HOA. She folded her arms without the slightest embarrassment. You can't just sit on land forever. Behind her, several residents had started gathering near the sidewalk to watch the argument unfold. I kept my voice calm. You are trespassing. Remove every piece of equipment, every form, and every worker from this property immediately. Denise smiled like I'd made an unreasonable request. The community voted for this project. The community doesn't own this land. She looked back at the growing crowd before answering loudly enough for everyone to hear. We're not stopping. And just like that, she turned the entire situation into a public challenge. By that afternoon, the HOA Facebook page had already turned me into the villain. Denise posted smiling concept sketches of the future playground beside a long, emotional caption about creating safe spaces for neighborhood children. Buried halfway through the post was a carefully worded sentence accusing me of trying to shut down a community project out of spite. The comments exploded within hours. Some people only care about money. What kind of person fights against a playground? He doesn't even live here anyway. Reading through them felt surreal because almost nobody cared about the actual facts. They cared about emotion, kids, families, community pride. And Denise understood that better than anyone. Construction resumed 2 days later, despite my warning. By the weekend, children were already climbing on partially installed equipment while parents stood nearby taking pictures like it was some neighborhood celebration. Meanwhile, my mailbox filled with anonymous letters. Selfish. Greedy. Move away. One envelope contained nothing except a printed photo of the playground plans with the words, "Don't ruin this," written across it in red marker. Then the vandalism started. I arrived at the property one evening and found bright white spray paint across the fence facing the street. Let the kids play. For a long moment I just stood there staring at it while traffic rolled past behind me. That was the hardest part of the entire situation in the beginning, realizing public opinion mattered more than truth. At least temporarily. Nobody wanted to hear about deeds, permits, liability exposure, or property law. They saw swings and slides and smiling children. Denise had successfully wrapped illegal behavior inside the appearance of generosity. And suddenly I wasn't a property owner defending his land anymore. I was the man trying to destroy a playground. The isolation hit harder than I expected. Everywhere I went near Willow Creek, conversation stopped when I walked by. People looked at me like I'd become some bitter outsider attacking families for no reason. But underneath all the frustration, I kept reminding myself of one thing. Facts don't stop being facts just because a crowd gets emotional. 3 days after the construction started, I met with a land use attorney named Richard Bellamy, whose office overlooked the county courthouse downtown. I'd worked around enough property disputes over the years to know when a situation stopped being a neighborhood conflict and started becoming serious legal exposure. The moment Richard finished reviewing the survey maps and construction photos, he leaned back slowly in his chair and stared at me over the top of his glasses. "They did all this without permission from the owner?" I nodded once. "And children are already using the equipment." That was the part that visibly shocked him. Most HOA disputes involve petty violations or covenant disagreements. Fence heights, paint colors, parking issues. This was different. This was unauthorized construction on private property involving public use recreational equipment. Legally, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Richard started breaking the situation down piece by piece while highlighting sections of county code on his computer screen. Public use playgrounds required specific permits, safety inspections, drainage compliance, and accessibility standards under ADA regulations. Even commercial developers had to navigate months of approvals before installing recreational structures. Willow Creek had done none of that. Worse, if a child got injured on illegally installed equipment sitting on my property, lawyers could still attempt to drag me into the liability chain simply because I owned the land. That realization changed everything for me. Until then, I'd been angry. Now I became careful. Richard contacted the county planning office while I sat there, and within 20 minutes we discovered the HOA had never obtained proper permits for the project at all. Not provisional permits. Not temporary approvals. Nothing. The equipment contractor had apparently relied entirely on HOA representations that the land belonged to subdivision common area. "That contractor's going to panic when he realizes this," Richard muttered. From that moment forward, I documented everything obsessively. Photos every morning and evening, timestamps on all construction activity, copies of HOA Facebook posts, screenshots of board announcements, contractor company names, truck license plates, emails, violation notices. Every conversation got summarized in written notes the second I returned home. And slowly my mindset shifted. I stopped thinking emotionally, stopped caring about neighborhood gossip, stopped feeling the need to defend myself publicly. Because once you understand how much legal exposure someone has created for themselves, patience becomes a weapon. And Denise had no idea how exposed she really was. Most people would have backed down after learning they'd illegally built on private property. Denise accelerated. Within a week, construction activity doubled. More trucks arrived. Fresh mulch got spread around the equipment. Decorative benches appeared near the retention pond. Volunteers planted flowers around the perimeter like they were preparing for a magazine photo shoot instead of a legal disaster. Then the HOA announced a public ribbon-cutting ceremony. Flyers appeared across the neighborhood advertising a celebration of community growth scheduled for Saturday afternoon, complete with food trucks, games, and a speech from Denise herself. And somehow the story got even uglier. During a neighborhood Facebook livestream, Denise told residents I was trying to sue children out of greed. Not the HOA, not the contractors. Children. That wording spread through the subdivision like gasoline through dry grass. Meanwhile, I received a formal letter from the HOA's attorney demanding I cease interference with ongoing community improvements. The language sounded aggressive at first glance, but the more carefully I read it, the more interesting it became. The lawyer never once claimed the HOA owned the property. Not directly. Not indirectly. Instead, the letter danced around ownership completely, referring only to disputed usage rights and community benefit considerations. That told me something important immediately. Their attorney already knew they were in trouble. A competent lawyer would never avoid ownership language unless the documentation was weak or outright indefensible. And once I realized that, I made a deliberate decision that confused everyone around me. I stayed completely silent. No Facebook arguments. No public statements. No interviews with angry residents. Nothing. While Denise kept getting louder and louder, I stopped reacting entirely. Because sometimes silence makes people overconfident. And overconfident people make catastrophic mistakes. The deeper I looked into the playground project, the less it resembled community improvement, and the more it looked like a private scheme wrapped in cheerful branding. It started with the contractor invoices. Richard managed to obtain preliminary vendor information through a records request tied to the HOA's insurance disclosures, and one company name immediately stood out to me. Holloway Recreational Supply LLC, same last name as Denise. At first I thought it might be coincidence. It wasn't. After a little digging, I discovered the company belonged to Denise's cousin, a man who specialized in small commercial playground installations several counties over. Suddenly, the rushed timeline, emotional pressure campaign, and refusal to stop construction made a lot more sense. Money was involved. And not small money either. The invoices looked inflated from the beginning. Equipment costs seemed unusually high compared to standard municipal pricing, and labor charges were padded with vague community enhancement fees that didn't clearly explain anything. Meanwhile, Willow Creek's HOA reserve funds were draining at an alarming speed. Residents still thought the playground was some harmless neighborhood project funded through routine dues. They had no idea thousands upon thousands of dollars were disappearing into contracts Denise controlled personally. Then I got a phone call late one evening from a number I didn't recognize. The woman introduced herself quietly as Carol Jensen, the former HOA treasurer. "I think you need to know what Denise did," she said. According to Carol, the board never conducted a proper membership vote for the playground project at all. Denise pushed it through during a poorly attended meeting while framing it as a minor beautification initiative. That mattered legally. Many HOAs require formal member approval before using reserve funds on major capital projects, especially recreational construction involving long-term liability exposure. Carol sounded nervous the entire conversation. She kept saying the land issue was already handled, she admitted. But nobody actually saw ownership documents. A few days later, Carol anonymously forwarded me internal HOA emails. And that's when everything changed. Buried inside one message chain was a scanned copy of my official survey map, the exact same document I'd shown contractors weeks earlier. Denise had received it before construction even began, meaning she already knew the property belonged to me. She ignored it anyway. I sat at my kitchen table rereading those emails over and over, while the reality settled heavily into my chest. This wasn't arrogance anymore. It was deliberate. The playground officially opened on a Saturday afternoon under bright blue skies and strings of cheap decorative balloons. I watched from across the road, parked inside my truck with the engine off. Children ran across the mulch laughing while music played through portable speakers near the retention pond. Parents carried folding chairs onto my property like they'd been doing it their entire lives. Food trucks lined the curb. Denise stood near the entrance, smiling beside a giant ceremonial ribbon while neighbors applauded around her. From a distance, it looked beautiful. And honestly, that made everything harder. Because none of this was the children's fault. They didn't understand property law, liability exposure, fraudulent approvals, or manipulated HOA politics. They just saw swings, slides, and a place to play with friends on a warm afternoon. Part of me wanted to walk away completely. Sell the land. End the stress. Let the neighborhood keep the playground. But deep down, I knew exactly what would happen if I surrendered now. People like Denise survive because they weaponize guilt. They hide behind words like community and for the children, while ignoring rules they'd aggressively enforce against everyone else. And once someone learns they can take from you emotionally, they rarely stop at one boundary. That realization sat heavily in my chest while I watched strangers occupy land I'd spent years protecting. Because boundaries only matter when they're defended, not when it's convenient, not when public opinion turns against you, not when standing your ground becomes uncomfortable. I kept thinking about every survey marker removed from the dirt, every false complaint, every lie spread through the neighborhood, every resident manipulated into believing ownership was optional if enough people wanted something badly enough. And suddenly I understood the real danger wasn't just losing the property. It was allowing the idea to stand that private rights could simply disappear under social pressure. As the ribbon-cutting ceremony ended, Denise grabbed a pair of oversized scissors for photos while the crowd applauded around her. That was the moment something inside me finally hardened. I picked up my phone, called Richard, and told him to prepare the full legal action package. No more warnings. No more negotiations. We were done being patient. The HOA scheduled their celebratory board meeting exactly 9 days after the playground grand opening. Denise advertised it like a victory parade. The community clubhouse parking lot overflowed with SUVs and golf carts by the time I arrived that evening. Through the windows, I could already see residents laughing around folding tables covered in snacks and lemonade while children ran through the hallways wearing little Willow Creek Playground Day stickers. Nobody looked worried. Why would they? As far as the neighborhood knew, Denise had won. I parked quietly near the back row and sat in the truck for a moment, watching the building glow under the streetlights. Then I grabbed my folder, adjusted my jacket, and walked inside beside Richard. The room changed the second people noticed us. Conversations lowered. Smiles faded. A few residents whispered immediately, while Denise, seated near the front beside the other board members, forced an exaggerated smile onto her face. "Well," she announced loudly, "looks like we have a guest tonight." I ignored her completely and took a seat near the back wall beside Richard without saying a word. That silence made people uncomfortable faster than arguing ever could. The meeting started normally enough. Budget discussions, landscaping updates, maintenance schedules. Denise spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the entire room belonged to her. Then the clubhouse doors opened again. A county inspector walked in first, carrying a leather folder beneath one arm. Right behind him came a sheriff's deputy. The atmosphere shifted instantly. People turned in their chairs. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Denise blinked twice rapidly, her polished smile finally slipping for the first time all evening. And then 2 process servers entered behind them. That's when the room truly went silent. No music, no whispering, nothing except the sound of paper sliding from envelopes. One by one, the servers began handing legal packets directly to the HOA board members seated at the front table. I watched the reactions spread across their faces almost in sequence. Confusion first, then panic, then anger. One board member started flipping through pages frantically, while another looked toward Denise like she was waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Denise herself went pale beneath the fluorescent lights as the sheriff's deputy stepped closer to the front table. Richard remained perfectly calm beside me. The lawsuits covered everything: trespassing, unauthorized land use, fraud allegations tied to knowingly ignoring ownership records, liability exposure involving unpermitted public recreational structures, emergency injunction requests demanding immediate closure and removal of the playground. The county inspector finally stepped forward and spoke in a flat, professional tone that somehow sounded louder than shouting. "We've received multiple code and permit violations regarding this installation." The room erupted into overlapping voices. Residents demanded explanations. Board members started talking over each other. Someone near the back muttered, "Oh my God." And through all the chaos, Denise suddenly pointed at me. "This is insane," she snapped. "You're really doing this over a playground?" For the first time all night, I stood up. The clubhouse became completely silent again. I looked directly at her while the legal documents sat spread across the table in front of the board. Then I answered calmly enough that every single person in the room heard it clearly. "You built a public hazard on private property." And judging by the fear spreading across their faces, they were finally starting to understand exactly how serious that mistake really was. The county shut the playground down less than 24 hours after the board meeting. By sunrise the next morning, bright red warning tags hung from the equipment while yellow barricade tape wrapped around the entire property. 2 county vehicles sat near the entrance as inspectors walked the site carrying clipboards and measuring tools, while angry residents gathered along the sidewalk trying to figure out what was happening. The mood had completely changed. A week earlier, parents were posting smiling playground photos online. Now people looked nervous, and the deeper inspectors dug into the project, the worse everything became. First came the permit issue. There were none. No approved site development applications, no recreational use permits, no inspection records, nothing filed through the county whatsoever. Denise had essentially pushed forward a public use construction project using little more than HOA approval and confidence. Then inspectors discovered drainage problems. The playground sat too close to a low runoff area near the retention pond, meaning heavy rain could create standing water beneath sections of the equipment. One inspector explained quietly that saturated ground could destabilize support structures over time. But the installation depth findings caused the real panic. Several support posts had not been anchored deep enough to meet safety requirements for public use playground equipment. One county official physically demonstrated how certain structures shifted under pressure. Parents standing nearby immediately pulled their children away from the barricades. And then came the ADA compliance violations. No proper accessibility pathways. No compliant entry design. No approved mobility access surfaces. The county report kept growing by the hour. By afternoon, residents who had defended Denise online were suddenly demanding answers instead. People felt betrayed after realizing their children had been allowed to play on equipment that hadn't passed even basic inspection standards. Local media picked up the story that evening. A news van parked outside Willow Creek, while reporters filmed footage of the red-tagged playground behind caution tape. Headlines framed it as an HOA overreach scandal involving unauthorized construction and child safety concerns. That's when Denise tried saving herself. During an interview, she blamed the contractors entirely, claimed the HOA had relied on professional assurances that everything met legal standards. It might have worked too, except the contractors panicked the moment they heard her shifting blame publicly. Within 48 hours, their legal team released internal emails proving Denise and the HOA board had knowingly pushed the project forward despite repeated warnings about ownership documentation and permit verification. One email hit particularly hard. A contractor had explicitly written, "Before further installation proceeds, we need confirmation this parcel legally belongs to the subdivision." Denise's response sat directly underneath it. "Continue work as planned. The community expects completion." After that, whatever support she still had inside Willow Creek started collapsing fast, because now the entire neighborhood could finally see the truth. This hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been deliberate. The collapse happened slowly at first, then all at once. For years, Denise had controlled Willow Creek through confidence. She always sounded certain, always acted like she had answers. People trusted her because she spoke with the authority of someone who never appeared afraid. But lawsuits have a way of stripping performance away from people, especially during discovery. The first cracks appeared when several long-time HOA allies quietly resigned from committee positions. Residents who used to defend Denise aggressively online suddenly stopped commenting altogether. Others deleted old Facebook posts attacking me once the county findings became public. Nobody wanted to be attached to the disaster anymore. Then the financial records surfaced. Richard's office obtained internal HOA expenditures tied to the playground project, and the numbers immediately raised questions. Equipment pricing exceeded comparable municipal installations by shocking margins. Consulting fees appeared without documentation. Project coordination expenses had been billed repeatedly despite no clear explanation of what services were actually provided, and sitting in the middle of it all was Denise's cousin's company. Once residents realized HOA reserve funds had potentially been funneled into inflated family contracts, outrage exploded inside the neighborhood. Emergency board meetings turned chaotic. Homeowners demanded audits. People who once applauded Denise now interrupted her publicly during discussions. I heard one resident yell, "You used our dues like a personal checking account." Then the insurance problem surfaced. The HOA's insurance carrier sent a formal notice reserving the right to deny coverage entirely due to unauthorized construction, potential fraud exposure, and knowingly ignored permit requirements. That terrified everyone. Without coverage, the HOA itself, and potentially individual board members, could become personally exposed to massive legal costs. For the first time since all this started, Denise looked genuinely shaken. The polished appearance disappeared almost overnight. She stopped dressing sharply at meetings. Dark circles formed beneath her eyes. Her voice lost that calm, rehearsed confidence she'd carried for years. During one particularly tense gathering, I watched her hands trembling while she shuffled through paperwork at the front table. Meanwhile, I stayed completely calm. No gloating, no angry speeches, no public humiliation campaigns. I simply let the evidence speak for itself, and that became the emotional turning point for the community, because people finally understood something important. I'd been telling the truth from the very beginning. The property wasn't abandoned. The permits didn't exist. The playground had never been legal. And every warning I gave had been ignored deliberately, while Denise manipulated the neighborhood into treating me like the enemy. One evening, while checking the mail near the property, an older resident approached me quietly. "I owe you an apology," he admitted without meeting my eyes. "A lot of us do." I looked past him toward the empty playground sitting behind county barricades. For weeks I'd felt isolated inside my own fight, but standing there in the fading evening light I realized the tide had finally turned. Not because I'd argued louder than Denise, because the truth eventually became impossible to hide. The injunction hearing took place on a grey Thursday morning inside a packed county courtroom that smelled faintly of old paper and rain-soaked jackets. By the time Richard and I arrived, nearly half the room was already filled with Willow Creek residents. Some looked nervous. Others looked embarrassed to even be there. Denise sat at the defense table beside the HOA attorney, wearing a pale blue blazer that looked noticeably less polished than usual. She avoided eye contact with almost everyone. The judge entered sharply at exactly 9 o'clock, and within minutes it became obvious he'd already reviewed the preliminary filings in detail. And he was not happy. The county inspection reports alone were brutal. Photos of unpermitted construction flashed across courtroom monitors, while inspectors explained drainage failures, installation deficiencies, and missing compliance approvals. Every new document seemed to deepen the judge's irritation. Then Richard began presenting my documentation. Time-stamped photographs, survey maps, county ownership records, trail camera footage, emails, contractor correspondence. One by one, months of careful records stacked together into something impossible to dismiss. That's the thing about property disputes most people don't understand. Courts often respond extremely harshly when private entities knowingly ignore established property boundaries. Judges can tolerate misunderstandings. They can tolerate paperwork errors. What they hate is deliberate disregard. And Denise's own emails had destroyed any argument that this had been accidental. At one point, the judge removed his glasses slowly while reviewing the contractor email warning the HOA about ownership verification. Then he looked directly at Denise. "You proceeded anyway?" Her attorney tried stepping in, but Denise interrupted emotionally before he could stop her. "We were trying to do something positive for the community," she insisted. Families needed that playground. Children were benefiting from it. The judge cut her off instantly. "Community benefit does not erase private property rights, Ms. Holloway." The courtroom fell silent. Denise looked stunned, but the judge wasn't finished. He continued reviewing photographs showing playground structures installed on my parcel despite written ownership warnings. Then he turned toward the HOA attorney again. "Your clients exposed children to potential safety hazards on land they did not own, while bypassing permit requirements entirely. This court finds that conduct deeply concerning." You could actually feel the tension spreading through the room. Residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several avoided looking toward the HOA table altogether. Then came the ruling. The judge granted the injunction immediately. Full removal of all playground structures, mandatory restoration of the property to pre-construction condition, and temporary freezing of discretionary HOA spending pending financial review and ongoing litigation. The words landed like concrete blocks in the room. Several residents audibly gasped. One board member buried his face in his hands. Denise stared forward motionless while her attorney whispered something urgently beside her. Meanwhile, I just sat there quietly listening as the judge finalized the order. Because after months of being painted as the villain, after being accused of suing children, after watching strangers occupy my land while calling me selfish, the truth had finally become official. Not online, not through rumors, not through HOA spin. In a courtroom, on the record, where facts actually mattered. The county gave the HOA 10 days to remove the playground. By day 3, demolition crews had already arrived. I stood near the edge of the property early that morning, watching workers in reflective vests dismantle the same structures residents had celebrated only weeks earlier. The bright plastic slides came down first, then the climbing walls, then the swings. Metal chains clattered into dumpsters while forklifts lifted sections of equipment onto flatbed trailers under direct county supervision. Nobody was smiling anymore. Residents gathered quietly along the sidewalks and cul-de-sacs, watching the scene unfold in near silence. Parents who once posted cheerful playground photos online now looked angry, embarrassed, or exhausted. Children kept asking confused questions while barricade tape snapped in the wind around the empty mulch pit. And right in the middle of all of it sat Denise's abandoned "Coming Soon" banner, half torn and covered in dirt. The symbolism almost felt too perfect. What surprised me most wasn't the anger directed at me. It was how fast the neighborhood turned on the HOA itself. The same residents who had accused me of destroying a playground were suddenly demanding explanations about legal fees, reserve shortages, and insurance exposure. Once the emergency financial disclosures became public, the mood inside Willow Creek shifted from embarrassment to outright panic. The lawsuits, inspections, attorney costs, and remediation expenses had drained HOA reserves far faster than anyone expected. Then came the emergency assessment notice. Every homeowner in Willow Creek received a letter explaining that additional payments would be required to stabilize HOA finances during ongoing litigation. People lost their minds. Residents who once defended Denise publicly were now furious they might personally pay for her decisions. Neighbors started openly discussing lawsuits against the board itself. Emergency meetings became shouting matches filled with accusations and financial fears. And then, 4 days after the dismantling began, Denise resigned. No dramatic speech, no apology. Just a short typed statement claiming she was stepping away for personal reasons. After years of acting untouchable, she disappeared almost overnight. The strangest part came afterward. One by one, neighbors started approaching me quietly. At the gas station, near the mailbox clusters, outside local stores, none of them were dramatic conversations. Most lasted less than a minute. "You were right. We shouldn't have believed everything. I'm sorry for how people treated you." An older couple even apologized for one of the anonymous complaint letters after admitting Denise encouraged residents to apply pressure against me early on. I accepted every apology calmly. But as I stood watching the last truck haul the playground equipment away from my property, I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly crowds changed direction. People had mocked me when I stood alone, then apologized once the consequences arrived. And somewhere deep down, I think that realization disturbed the neighborhood almost as much as the lawsuit itself. Once the playground was finally gone, the property looked wounded. Deep tire tracks cut through the dirt where heavy equipment had crossed repeatedly during construction and demolition. Patches of dead grass surrounded the areas where concrete footings had been ripped from the ground. Broken mulch still clung to sections of the fence line, while scraps of caution tape fluttered from weeds near the retention pond. For the first time in months, though, the land was quiet again. No shouting children, no HOA banners, no construction noise before sunrise. Just wind moving through open space the way it used to before all of this started. I hired a restoration crew the following week. Not because the county ordered it, the HOA was already legally responsible for remediation costs, but because I wanted control of the process myself. After months of watching strangers treat my property like public territory, reclaiming it physically mattered more to me than the money. Fresh fencing went up first. Stronger posts, taller panels, clean steel gates with updated locks and reflective private property signs mounted every 50 feet along the perimeter. Nothing aggressive or hostile, just clear. Then came the surveyors. I watched them work early one morning beneath pale sunlight while they re-established every official boundary marker around the parcel. Orange flags snapped softly in the breeze as equipment beeped across the dirt. One surveyor hammered the final stake into the ground and said something that stayed with me afterward. Most boundary disputes get ugly because people wait too long to push back. He was right. That's how encroachment becomes normal. It rarely starts with massive land grabs or dramatic confrontations. Usually it begins with small assumptions people allow to grow unchecked. A fence pushed a little too far. Unauthorized use excused because it helps everybody. Rules bent for convenience until eventually someone starts believing ownership itself is negotiable. That was the real danger Denise created. Not the playground, the mindset behind it. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere around the property slowly changed again. Grass regrew across damaged areas. Traffic noise from the nearby highway blended softly with evening crickets. The tension that had hung over the land for months finally started fading. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I could stand near the fence at sunset without feeling like I was defending something under attack. The property finally felt like mine again. By the end of the month, the entire Willow Creek HOA board was gone. Some resigned voluntarily before formal investigations expanded further. Others were voted out during one of the most heavily attended emergency meetings the subdivision had ever seen. Residents packed the clubhouse so tightly people stood along walls and spilled into the hallway outside just to listen. The atmosphere felt completely different from the smug confidence Denise once controlled. Now people wanted answers. Financial records were projected onto screens while homeowners demanded explanations for missing reserve funds, unauthorized expenditures, and legal decisions made without proper approval. Every conversation seemed fueled by the same uncomfortable realization. This never would have happened if residents had questioned leadership sooner. For years, people treated the HOA board like authority figures instead of elected neighbors. Denise thrived inside that culture because fear and conformity did half her work for her. Residents stayed quiet to avoid fines, public shaming, or becoming targets themselves. Even people who privately disagreed with her usually complied because resistance felt socially expensive. And slowly that silence gave her power. The new board understood they had to rebuild trust from the ground up. So the reforms came quickly. Mandatory financial oversight procedures were introduced requiring independent review of major expenditures. Any future capital project now needed formal legal review before approval. Member voting safeguards were strengthened to prevent boards from pushing through expensive developments without transparent community participation. Suddenly everything required documentation, written disclosures, recorded votes, outside verification. Ironically, the same neighborhood that once mocked me for insisting on paperwork became obsessed with accountability almost overnight. But beneath the policy changes, something deeper had shifted too. People stopped blindly assuming community leadership automatically meant good intentions. Residents who once followed Denise without question started recognizing how easily fear of conflict can distort judgment. Nobody wanted to admit they'd ignored warning signs because it felt easier to trust confidence than investigate facts. That realization humbled the entire neighborhood. One evening, while driving past the clubhouse after another reform meeting, I noticed something strange. The giant HOA bulletin board near the entrance had been completely cleared. No passive-aggressive notices. No violation photos. No public shaming posts. Just a simple printed sign announcing, "Open community discussion next Tuesday." For the first time since I'd known Willow Creek, the place actually felt less tense. Not perfect, but quieter. And maybe that was the real irony in all of this. The community Denise claimed she was protecting only began improving after people finally stopped being afraid of her. About 6 weeks after the playground removal, I got a phone call from a commercial developer based out of Dallas. At first, I almost ignored it. By then, I was exhausted from months of legal meetings, inspections, and HOA fallout. But the moment the caller mentioned the upcoming highway interchange project, I pulled the truck over and listened carefully. He wanted to discuss my property. Apparently, the county's newest zoning adjustments had just been approved quietly during a transportation planning session. The future highway exit, the same one I'd been tracking for years, was officially moving forward faster than expected. And suddenly my little empty dirt lot became one of the most strategically positioned parcels in the entire area. Traffic studies predicted thousands of additional vehicles passing nearby daily once construction finished. Commercial developers had already started circling surrounding properties, trying to secure frontage access before prices exploded. The man on the phone asked if I'd consider partnership opportunities instead of an outright sale. Coffee shop concepts, small office development, climate-controlled storage investment. Even a mixed-use retail strip had apparently been floated during early discussions. After the call ended, I drove out to the property near sunset and stood quietly beside the fence while traffic rolled steadily down the county road nearby. For months, that land had been treated like wasted space. Neighbors mocked it. Denise called it an eyesore. The HOA tried to turn it into something they could control because they assumed unused meant unimportant. But they completely misunderstood what value actually looks like. Real value isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly while impatient people overlook it. The irony almost made me laugh standing there in the evening wind. The same parcel everyone complained about had quietly become the most valuable piece of land anywhere near Willow Creek. And now, after everything that happened, nobody questioned who it belonged to anymore. Not the HOA. Not Denise. Not the neighborhood. Mine. Completely. Legally. Undeniably. And somehow that felt more satisfying than any courtroom victory ever could. People kept asking afterward if I regretted not fighting harder earlier. The truth is, restraint saved me. If I had screamed at neighbors, threatened residents online, or exploded publicly the way Denise probably expected me to, none of this would have ended the same way. Emotional outbursts make good gossip, but they make terrible evidence. Documentation wins. Quiet records win. Patience wins. That was the biggest lesson the entire situation reinforced for me. Because bullies rarely rely on actual authority as much as people think they do. Most of them survive on pressure. Social pressure. Public embarrassment. Fear of conflict. They count on exhausting people emotionally until resistance feels harder than surrender. Denise understood that perfectly. She wanted me angry, wanted me isolated, wanted the neighborhood to view me as unreasonable before facts ever reached a courtroom. But boundaries matter most when defending them becomes uncomfortable. That applies to land, to business, to life in general. Once people learn they can cross your boundaries without consequences, they rarely stop voluntarily. They simply push farther the next time. Weeks after the lawsuit settled into quieter legal processes, I started visiting the property again in the evenings, just to walk it alone. No cameras, no contractors, no county vehicles parked outside, just open space and silence. The tension that had lived in my chest for months slowly disappeared step by step across that dirt. And one evening, while standing near the western fence line watching sunlight fade across the grass, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Denise. Not at the HOA. Not even at the neighbors who turned against me. Because in the end, the property was still there, and so was I. A few nights later, I walked the property one last time just before sunset. Fresh grass had started growing across the restored sections of dirt, while the new fencing cast long shadows across the ground. The air smelled like warm earth and fresh-cut cedar from the replacement posts. In the distance, traffic hummed steadily along the county road where the future highway expansion would eventually rise. And somewhere beyond the retention pond, I could hear children laughing again. This time, though, the sound came from the town-owned public park, a few blocks away. An actual legal playground built with permits, inspections, insurance, and community approval done the right way. That contrast stayed with me, because the problem was never children playing. It was people believing good intentions gave them the right to take what wasn't theirs. I stopped near the center of the lot and looked out across the quiet property one final time as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Then I thought about everything Willow Creek had put itself through just because nobody challenged control early enough. And honestly, one truth summed up the entire experience better than anything else ever could. Communities survive on trust. The moment people start confusing control with ownership, everything falls apart. Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or property dispute? Share your story in the comments.